How you doing, guys? So in today's video, a common problem that comes up in the software design and development course is basically having to translate between some sort of programming language like Python, and translating to pseudocode. Now, pseudocode in this course is actually based off a language called COBOL, right? And so it's a very archaic kind of syntax. And COBOL isn't, as a language, isn't really used today. The only instance where COBOL is used in bank mainframes, because banks have been around for a very long time, and the programming language around those days was COBOL. So it's a very old style. So most pseudocode you'll see in the course, including in the exam, is going to look like some bizarre COBOL-based syntax. So in today's video, I'm going to do a quick example of a Python problem, and then we're going to translate it to this pseudocode COBOL, which is something you'll need to do for the exam, or not for the exam, but maybe for an assignment, which I've seen pretty commonly. So let's jump right into it. So let's say you've got some Python here. Let's say you've got a list. We'll just go nums equals, I don't know, 1, 7, 8. Let's say you've got a value, say 3. So let's say we want to do just implement a linear search. So we're going to be given a list of numbers or an array, and we have a target value that we're looking for, and we're going to feed that into a submodule from the main module, and we're going to basically ask the submodules, or the function is going to return either true or false depending on whether the value exists in this array. So in Python, how you do a submodule or a function is you go def, we'll call it linear search, and we're going to give it a, we'll just say nums val. And just to make it make more sense, we'll define a main program. And we'll put this in here. And then we'll just call main down here. Okay, so we pass in, then here we'll call linear search nums val. Okay, so basically we're going to go ahead and define a linear search. So basically what we do is we'll keep it simple. We'd go I equals 0 while I is less than the length of nums. And we say if nums I is val, then return true. And then don't forget to increment your I. And then we go return false, right? So we'll go ahead and run this. So by the way, this is VS Code, which is pretty much the stock standard in programming, like in the industry. So I'd recommend learning VS Code. So you run this, we'll just whatever, just untitled. So we'll run it. Okay, VS Code just crashed, but don't worry, we're back. So we're just going to print the result. So we'll say print. We'll say, okay, so with a print statement in Python, what we're going to say is if this number exists in the list. So to do that, first we need to go str to convert an integer to a string. We're going to say, so we'll say, does exist in the list. And then we're going to do that. So let's try this, run this. Then we have to also convert a bool to a string. So run this. All right, so there you go. So does 3 exist in the list? The answer is false because we've got 178, we have 3. So let's put in the number 7 instead. So then we run this. Does 7 exist in the list? True. All right, so that's our code. So let's just clean it up a bit. So this is our Python code. So now what we're going to do is convert the entire thing to see if we can just make this look a bit neater. Now what we're going to do is convert this to pseudocode. So we're going to start with the main. So with pseudocode, you need like an opening statement. So we use begin. So we say begin main, right? Then setting variables is pretty much the same. So you can say val equals 7. That's fine. Alternatively, you can also say set val to 7. So you can use plain English to describe how to like assign a value to a variable. So you can use plain English as long as it matches the operation you're trying to do. But just keep it simple. Just say val equals 7. You can say nums. Now, in this syntax, they don't use box brackets. They use square brackets. So this would also be fine, just saying nums equals 178. For some reason, yeah, they use that. Alternatively, you can say set nums as a array of integers. Now, in COBOL, they don't really use the word list. They use the word array strictly. Now, in Python, because Python was meant to be a lot simpler, there is no such thing as an array in Python. It's just lists. Now, what you need to know is that there's actually a technical difference between an array and a list. So a list has what we call a dynamic size, whereas an array is a static size. So what do we mean by that is when you create a list, right? Let's say you have 3 numbers and you store those 3 numbers in a list. If you want to add a 4th number, it's easy. You can just dynamically add it and the list increases in size from 3 numbers, like say 7, 8, 10. You can add an 11 to the end and increase the list size to 4. Now, with an array, you can't do that. Basically, once you create the array, you can't add an extra number to it. You can only modify the existing numbers in it. So in order to add an extra number, you have to literally create an entirely new array, right? So there is actually a technical difference. So in this course, they only use arrays. Okay. So now, so this is fine though. If you write nums equals 178, the marker will understand because this is very Pythonic, but you know, you have the brackets, right? Okay, so now we have print this. So in Python, the print statement is fine. Now, what I'd recommend is, so what we call this with the pluses is what we call string concatenation. And it's a bit bizarre to do that in pseudocode. And also you have this idea of converting integers to strings and booleans to strings. Now in pseudocode, you can probably get away with not having that. So the easiest way I would say was just say something like print. Like I would literally just separate it into separate print statements. So I'd say something like something like that. Okay. So I'd literally just separate it over separate lines because the mark will understand what you're trying to do, right? So print does, value exists in the list. Now, in this case, you probably don't have to worry about the formatting, right? Because the goal of the algorithm is to worry about formatting. Because normally when you write a print statement, there's actually a hidden what we call a new space character, which tells you to add an extra, like to end the line and go to a new line. Now, there's a lot of ambiguity about that. So it's like a hidden character. So I wouldn't worry too much about formatting here. And in fact, usually, so that's probably the best way to describe it if you had to do it. But honestly, probably the easiest way, the marker would understand for a functional perspective would just to be like, say, print linear search nums val, which is just a practical true or false, right? Because usually the question will be like, does the value exist or not, and return the value or print the value. So you could just go print linear search nums val, so it'll return true or false, or you could even just go like literally, you know, just do something like that, like literally set the initial conditions, pass them to the submodule, and then return whatever the submodule or the function returns, right? So it might be something like that. So let's just keep it really simple like that. That's also fine, and usually you won't do that, but let's just match it 1-to-1. Then we go end, okay? So end, you can also write end main, right? Now, notice how capitalization in pseudocode is really important. So capitalization. So any kind of reserved word or special word has to be capitalized, but all this stuff here doesn't, right? So if it's just the basic like setting values to variables and printing values, you don't need to capitalize it. In fact, you shouldn't, because it'll get confusing. The only thing I'll notice here is that in pseudocode, when you reference a submodule or a function, you should underline it, because that's how it shows that it's a function, right? Why they do this, I don't know. It's just a weird quirk of pseudocode. So, all right. So then what you do is you go begin linear search, nums val, say, right? Because now we're going to write the actual linear search. Now notice how in Python, generally, if you call something, right, you want it to be defined before, right? So notice how I wrote the main below the linear search, right? The reason this is because I don't think it matters critically, but just to be safe, because Python is an interpreter. So basically it means that it translates the code line by line. So the reason this is important is because if you try to call this function and you actually haven't translated it yet, then it may not exist and Python may throw an error. So that's why I define the function first before I decide to call it in the main. Now in pseudocode, doesn't matter. You can, generally it's best practice to define the main first, and then you define linear search below. So let's go. So I = 0. Now, once again, you've got a while loop, so that uses a special reserved word. So we go while I is less than, now, instead of going len nums, it's easier just to say size of nums, right? So use plain English, because len is a specific function in Python. So just to make sure they understand the pseudocode, just say size of nums, right? We can also say length of nums. That might be better, length of nums. So that's all you have to do. Then underneath, you can write, so indented, if nums I, then, so this is how you structure an if statement. You go if nums I equals val, then, and you write the then. And also notice that sometimes Okay, so I just accidentally pushed a button and lost it. Okay, so let's just okay, let's just keep going. So let's just write the if. So if nums I equals val, then now sometimes in pseudocode they decide not to have a double equals, they'll have a single equals, and they'll say, oh, because of the context, because it's in an if statement, you don't need to worry about writing a double equals. But I find that bad practice, and I'd always write a double equals in pseudocode anyway, because a single equals implies you're assigning a value to a variable, where a double equals implies that you're equating a Boolean condition that's either true or false. So I would maintain the double equals, because otherwise it's just confusing. So as I said, since there's a double equals, you're saying, does nums I equal val, right? As a comparison. Then you say return with a capitalization, return true. And then you have to write end if to signify the end of the if statement, right? And then obviously, because we were in the loop, you go I equals I plus 1. Notice how in Python I use I plus equals 1. Now, doing this kind of, that syntax is Pythonic, and sometimes other languages don't work like that. Sometimes, like for example, if you're in C or C++, you'd write it as I plus plus. So just to be safe, in pseudocode, just literally write out I equals I plus 1. Then what you want to do is write end while, right? Because remember, just before I cleared the board, I equals size of nums. You want to write an end while just to match up. So in Python, we represent code blocks with indentation. In pseudocode, you have to have a matching, like a while and an end while, or an if and an end if. In other languages, you use curly braces to signify the code block, but don't worry about that. Okay, what else? Then we go return false, and then we obviously go end linear search. And that's pretty much it. That would be the translation, the correct translation into pseudocode. There's nothing else really that you have to worry about, usually. Now, in pseudocode doesn't really have, so here's some last takeaway notes. Pseudocode doesn't really have a data structure for like dictionaries or hash maps, because in this course, they don't actually talk about hash maps or dictionaries at all. So if you're like a smart cookie and you decide to use hash maps in a dictionary in your major assignment or something, you will not see it at all in this course. So just be prepared. And pseudocode's a bit funny, right? So if you have to write pseudocode for a hash map, write a comment above it explaining what it is so the marker understands, or else it'll be very confusing. Other things I'll talk about just quickly is if you have an else, right? You only have you don't write else, like end else. You just literally write a single end if to capture it. So you don't have to worry about that. For a for loop, right? You'd write for I equals 0 to, like, say 10. Right? So that's a syntax for pseudocode for a for loop. Obviously, in Python, you would do, if I wanted to do that in Python, I would go for I equals 0. You'd actually just go for I in range 10. Right? And that's all you do, because the idea is you don't even have to set I, because range will produce values between 0 and 10, inclusive. So let's just, so if I just run this, actually, sorry, not, so the key difference here is if I was to write this in pseudocode, it would go 0 to 10, including the 10, right? Whereas in this, it doesn't include the last terminal value. So to get the 10, I'd have to change this to 11. So it's one less than the terminal value. So just be careful there. If, say, I wanted to not increase with a for loop, I don't want to increase by 1, I want to increase by 2, you can modify it with saying step 2, right? After this condition. And the idea is that instead of going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, it'll go 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. To do that here, I would say you'd have to go start at 0, finish at 11, and then step by 2. So if we run this, as you can see, it goes from 10, 8, 6, 4. So that's how you do that in Python. So for loops sometimes come up where you need to change it. So that's pretty much all it for this lesson or this video. So yeah, hope to see you in the next one.